There's a ton of confusion as to what happens to property values when you upzone.
The value of the properties are going to go down.
They're just going to go up in value.
It's going to decrease our property values.
Drive up housing costs.
Is there any kind of a proposal to redeem us if our property value goes down?
The answer is kind of surprising. So let's find out what actually happens. When you play SimCity, you'll notice that zoning is a key part of the game. You have residential zones with houses, commercial zones with shops and offices, and then industrial zones with factories. What's interesting is that if you put industrial zoning next to residential zoning, the property values for the residential zones plummet. And it kind of makes sense. People don't really want to live next to a sriracha plant. But keeping polluting factories away from homes isn't the real reason that zoning codes became widespread. Before zoning codes, things like slaughterhouses, tanneries, and brickyards were often banned from city limits anyway. They were pushed to the outskirts of town through nuisance laws, health codes, and local ordinances. What actually happened is that zoning and other housing restrictions came about partly due to this belief that they would protect property values.
Well, the property values will immediately go down if they are allowed to move in here in any number.
And that historical context, that mindset, sets the stage for where we are today. So we're going to take a look at 3 cases where zoning and property values came head to head throughout the history of urban America. This is the Equitable Building in Lower Manhattan. Some call this the start of zoning in America. In 1915, just after it was built, it caused quite the stir. It was the largest office building in the world by floor area, and it flooded the Lower Manhattan office market with well over 1 million square feet of additional floor space, resulting in rising vacancies and falling rents, or, affordable rents, as we call it today. Nearby property owners weren't happy, and they made it known. They filed for reduced property valuation assessments because of the shadows, and the building became the scapegoat for the specter of greed in a megalopolis out of control. Angry residents pushed for a zoning code with restrictions on height and setbacks. They didn't want any more equitable buildings, or perhaps some of them didn't want any more competition. And they won, with New York enacting one of the first zoning codes. At the time, zoning codes, like dictating the shape of the building you could put on your property, wasn't a traditional power of local government. It seems normal today, but at the time, this was an unprecedented curtailment of property rights. And it wasn't even totally clear that local governments were legally able to dictate these rules until about a decade later. In 1922, Euclid, Ohio, enacted a zoning ordinance that restricted most of the city to 1 and 2 family homes, basically prohibiting apartments or industrial development. Ambler Realty, which owned a large lot between a major road and the rail line, sued the village, claiming that the zoning ordinance drastically reduced what they could do with their land and thus reduced their property values. And they challenged the very constitutionality of zoning. A lower court agreed with Ambler, calling the ordinance a straitjacket on property. But the case eventually went to the Supreme Court, which later reversed that decision, saying that Ambler Realty's claims of reduced property values were speculative. Justice Sutherland, writing for the majority, upheld the constitutionality of zoning as a legitimate use of police power to protect general welfare and characterized apartments in low-density neighborhoods as mere parasites. This established the legal precedent that allowed local governments to restrict housing types, building shapes, and land use. The decision also implicitly endorsed the idea that excluding certain types of development, like apartments in single-family neighborhoods, were key for maintaining residential character and ultimately maintaining property values. As a quick side note, the lawyer who won that Supreme Court case would later express shock at how far localities would take their newly granted zoning powers, lamenting about a neighborhood drugstore which had been there for many years that was in an area that was now zoned for residential and was required to vacate within 1 year, noting, "Such death sentences have been held to be valid. To the writer, this is inconceivable." The third case takes place another decade later, after the Great Depression, when the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, started insuring mortgages as a way to help spur banks to provide more lending for housing.
Financed with a Federal Housing Administration insured mortgage on which he makes monthly payments of only $20.45.
But there was a catch, a pretty big catch. The FHA would only provide mortgage insurance in areas that had strict zoning codes. And the federal government just outright denied insurance to borrowers in areas that were deemed to be too risky and thus unsuitable for investment. What was considered risky? Well, any place that had an infiltration by inharmonious racial or nationality groups, I think you know where that's going, or inharmonious land uses, like retail or commercial near residential, or a bungalow surrounded by apartment buildings, or an apartment building in a neighborhood of detached houses, would be a questionable risk. That really shaped urban design in the country. The federal government put a ton of pressure on cities and towns to adopt zoning rules that matched FHA standards so that banks would issue loans to their neighborhoods. Those zoning codes, though, were often just blindly copy-pasted from one community to another rather than any attempt made to adapt them to local conditions. For cities that didn't adopt FHA-compliant zoning, residents found it nearly impossible to secure affordable mortgages, creating a feedback loop of disinvestment. In the early 1920s, only 48 places in the US had zoning laws. But by the end of the 1970s, almost every city, town, shire in America had adopted them, except for Houston, which famously resisted zoning, claiming even in the 1990s that zoning kills dreams. But for the rest of the country, many neighborhoods would now be locked in amber, with zoning codes limiting both growth and change. All three of these stories played significant roles in establishing and reinforcing zoning regulations and ultimately shaping the physical world around us. Again and again, zoning has been tied up in battles over property values where any increase in density or change in land use is assumed to come at the expense of others. That zero-sum mindset, where one property's gain means another property's loss, has shaped policy and public perception for over a century. But is that how zoning and property values actually work? Today's data tells a slightly different story, one that challenges those long-held assumptions about zoning and property values. So here's what we know. And to be clear, for the rest of the video, we're focusing on high-demand cities and metro regions. The trend over the past century has been ever-increasing restrictions on housing, such that it's now illegal to build more housing in 75% of our residential areas. Recently, this trend has started to reverse, with cities across the world dipping their toes into allowing more development. It's moving slowly, and it's moving even more slowly in the US. So we don't have that much data on what happens after dramatic upzoning. But we do have one really good case: Auckland, New Zealand. In 2016, Auckland implemented a massive overhaul of their zoning code called the Auckland Unitary Plan. This dramatically reduced restrictions on housing development and tripled the total number of homes that could be built in the city. Most notably, near urban centers and transit hubs, where they used to only allow one house, they now allow 5 to 7 story apartment buildings. And those lots, the single-family homes near urban centers, saw some of the most radical increases in property value. Lots here sold for more than twice what they would have sold for had the neighborhood not been upzoned. And this is compared to other lots that weren't upzoned, so it's already adjusted for inflation and everything. With the stroke of a pen, Auckland doubled the property values of many lots across the city. Nothing changed about these lots except for what was legally allowed to be built there. And these results aren't unique. They're only unique in the degree to which Auckland upzoned, which was much greater than what we've done in the US. But in 2013 and 2015, Chicago upzoned small targeted areas of the city, allowing a 20% boost in density, and those areas saw a 15 to 23% jump in property values. In 2019, Minneapolis relaxed their zoning restrictions in single-family neighborhoods in a small way. So small that it didn't even increase the total allowed buildable area. But the average lot saw a 3 to 5% increase in property values. And it was even more for lots with older homes. There is a consistent trend that upzoning is associated with rising property values. But I know what you're thinking. If property values are going up, doesn't that mean that housing is becoming that much more unaffordable? Doesn't that mean that rents are going up too? But that's not what we see. In Zurich, a study found that after upzoning, rents actually decreased region-wide. A similar pattern emerged in Sao Paulo, Brazil, where upzoning led to a 0.5% reduction in citywide housing costs. A literature review of all of the different studies summarizes the research. Most upzonings have been associated with increased property values, and upzonings may reduce housing costs region-wide. If you were paying attention, right? You'll notice this paper said something surprising. Property values go up even as housing costs can go down. Isn't that basically saying that housing's becoming more expensive as it's becoming more affordable? How could that possibly work? To see how property values could rise even as rents and housing costs fall, we first need to understand how the participants in the housing market interact. Let's take a look at a few scenarios. Let's say you're a landlord and you want to expand your portfolio of properties. You scoundrel, you. And suppose there are two options, a single-family house or a 6-unit apartment building. And just to make it precise, let's use actual numbers from my hometown of Falls Church, Virginia. The average house in my city rents for about $4,000 per month, whereas the average 1-bedroom apartment rents for about $2,000. So how much more valuable is the sixplex? Well, it'll make you about 3 times as much rent, so it's probably worth about 3 times as much. Okay, another scenario. This time you're a home builder, and you're considering buying a vacant lot to build homes on. How much is that lot worth to you? Well, it depends on what you can build there. From before, we know that a sixplex is worth about 3 times as much as a single family house, but it also costs a lot more to build. So after you account for those costs, very roughly speaking, it means that a vacant lot is worth about twice as much if you can build a sixplex on it instead of just a single family house. Okay, next scenario. You're still a home builder, but instead of buying a vacant lot, you're buying a lot that already has a house on it. How much would you pay for it? Again, it depends on what you can build there. If the most valuable thing you can build there is a single family house and it already has a single family house, then there's not much opportunity to add value. It's already near its maximum value. Maybe if it's an older, smaller house, you could perhaps replace it with a modern, larger house and make a profit, but the margins might be slim. But if instead you could replace it with a sixplex, same story as before. It's worth a lot more if you can build a sixplex. Now, let's take a look at the flip side of that scenario where you're the seller, not the buyer. So let's say you're an empty nester and you're looking to downsize. If your city recently upzoned and allowed for missing middle housing, duplexes, triplexes, maybe even sixplexes, then your home just got a lot more attractive to home builders, and they're willing to pay a lot more for it than if your city didn't allow for missing middle. The price it ultimately sells for depends on the market. And who knows, maybe your neighbor might be willing to sell their lot for less than you'd sell yours for, but how much the lot is worth is undeniably higher because the potential revenue of your lot went up tremendously. How much lots sell for all depends on how much demand there is for housing in your city. But in a housing crisis, in this economy, it's basically plenty of demand if you're anywhere near an urban core with good jobs. And now we kind of see what's going on. Even though each unit is worth less, higher density housing like a sixplex is more profitable than lower density housing, and so home builders are willing to pay a premium for lots that have a higher potential for redevelopment. And so upzoning results in 2 key things: underbuilt lots gaining property value, and the city gets more units of housing. And that additional housing supply also helps lower costs region-wide. At least that's the theory. But does this actually happen? Well, here's an example of this literally happening in DC. Here we have 3 2-bedroom townhouses. In 2021, these 2 were upzoned and sold to a developer. And here they are today. They were redeveloped into 9 units, all 2 bedrooms, and all of them are similar in size to the townhomes that they replaced. The property value of each of these new units is $600,000 to $900,000, which is certainly more affordable than the 2-bedroom and older $1 million property next door. And even though each of these individual units are more affordable, the developer bought both of the lots at a 50% premium compared to the other lot. The overall property value is absolutely higher for the upzoned lots, and you now allow 9 households to live in a place that's more affordable for them in a location that they wanted to be in. With the upzoning, we also now have 4 times the number of homes as before. From an economic perspective, it's a win for the home seller, a win for the home builder, and a win for the 9 new households. The value of the upzoned lots went up, property values increased, and then we added more homes that cost less, property values went down. And that brings us to the final piece of this puzzle, the distinction between property value and land value. With those examples, we can kind of intuit what's going on, but to understand it at a deeper level, we need to understand land value. A piece of real estate has two parts, the land, and then there's whatever gets built on the land. And for our discussion, that'll be housing. So the value of some property is just the value of the land plus the value of the house that's on the land. That is, property value equals house value plus land value. In the US, single-family homes are the most common form of home ownership, and so we frequently conflate the two. There's just one house on the lot, and so we think of property value and house value as one and the same. You'll hear things like,
I just bought a $3 million house!
but the truth is, it's not actually a $3 million house. It's probably a $1 million house on a $2 million piece of land. And that's the crucial distinction, that land has its own value. And in urban areas, land value usually exceeds the value of the house, and often by quite a bit. One way to value a piece of property is by how much you can rent it out for. And in most cases, that usually means just renting out whatever housing you have on there. But over time, houses depreciate, they decay, they fall into disrepair, they go out of fashion. And at the same time, the value of the land in the area is appreciating. The city gets more and higher paying jobs, better amenities with more shops and restaurants. It's more walkable, so more people want to live there. So at some point, it flips. The highest and best use of the property is actually to tear down the existing building and replace it with something new. Something with more units that collects more rent and houses more people, like we saw in the examples before. At this point, the entire market value of the property is in the land, in the opportunity to build more housing. How much more valuable rebuilding is than leaving the existing building is called the redevelopment premium. And how much this opportunity is worth, how much a piece of land is worth, how much a vacant lot is worth, comes down to its potential. How much housing could you profitably build? And in cities, this is almost always artificially limited, capped by zoning regulations. Zoning limits how much you can build, and that limits how valuable your land is. Which is to say that in such cases, zoning keeps land values lower than they would be otherwise. It makes it so that the resale value of a lot is much lower than it would be, like we saw in the examples before. So wouldn't lower land values actually mean that housing's more affordable? It's actually the opposite. Upzoning increases land values, but it also means that this land value gets split among multiple units. When we upzone, we allow for more units of housing, and those units now share the cost of the land. The land is more expensive, yes, but it's less costly per unit when it's split among 6 owners. You can also imagine an example where we do the opposite and downzone an empty lot, so much so that we can't build anything at all. We end up with no housing and a vacant lot. Congrats, we have a cheap lot, but we can't do much with it, and we restricted housing supply. But this actually raises a really interesting point. By keeping property values low, single-family zoning is in fact a kind of subsidy to homeowners. They get the benefit of living in a certain area without having to pay for the full cost incurred by excluding others from living there too. And it's a subsidy that's ultimately paid by renters by making housing in the area less affordable. And given that the average homeowner has 40 times the net worth of the average renter, it means that this is ultimately a subsidy to the rich from the poor. Single-family zoning is effectively a law which makes it illegal for a group of lower-income families to pool their resources together in order to outbid a single higher-income household for the same lot. And so we see downzoning resulting in lower land values, fewer homes, and fewer housing options means less overall affordability. Whereas upzoning results in higher land values, more homes, and more overall affordability. And the magnitude of this change, of property values rising while housing becomes more affordable, is directly proportional to how much development is capped by zoning. Auckland saw property values double when they allowed lots to go up to 5 to 7 stories. How much would property values have gained if zoning restrictions were relaxed even further? How much more affordable would housing be if we allowed it to be built in abundance? Maybe your city could be the first to find out.
Surely a 6-unit apartment building round the corner is not going to make my house more desirable.
So what? Who cares? Why bother having this conversation at all? Are we just trying to advocate for homeowners to have even more home wealth? I mean, maybe. Homeowners are some of the most vocal opposition to upzoning. They may not always say the self-interested property values part out loud, instead saying other more socially acceptable reasons, but they're also kind of voting against their own interests, or their own financial interests at least. Upzoning could increase their property value by literally millions of dollars. It's so potentially lucrative that Victoria, Australia has a windfalls gain tax on land value gains due to upzoning because they think it's kind of unfair for homeowners to make so much money on a simple policy change. In some sense, this gain in property values kind of amounts to a bribe to encourage homeowners to stop opposing upzoning. But it's not a very effective bribe unless they know they're being bribed, and thus this video. But surprisingly, some homeowners are actually opposed to their property values going up. And it kind of makes sense, right? Because that usually means that their property taxes go up too. But if you do the math, despite paying more in property tax, you make it all back and more. Financially, you come out ahead, just as long as you sell within the next 50 years or so. And there are ways to use that additional home equity to mitigate the increased cost in the meantime. But if you really don't want your property value to go up, then you must want it to go down, right? So here are a few ideas for how you can lower your property values. Dig more potholes, shoot in the air every couple weeks, dance badly in front of City Hall, break your window panes, build highways directly through your downtown, too many lawn ornaments. Obviously, don't actually do this, but good news. There are other ways upzoning can help ease your tax burden. Cities get more tax revenue per acre in dense, mixed-use areas. Denser housing has real economies of scale that make it more cost-effective. You have more taxpayers splitting the cost for the same amount of paved roads, electrical lines, pipes, and so on. And so the per-person tax bill for this infrastructure is lower. So it doesn't mean your property taxes have to go up. Your assessment goes up, sure, but so does every other house. And so unless your local government also decides to increase spending at the same time, they would have the ability to lower your tax rate so that the effective tax is almost the same. That's what we've done in my city. Property values have outpaced inflation, but we've repeatedly lowered the tax rate so that the effective tax that homeowners pay pretty much matches inflation. Beyond that, upzoning creates opportunities for home builders to take on new projects, which means more work for construction crews, contractors, suppliers. More demand equals more jobs, higher wages, and a stronger local economy. It's easy to look at huge property values and think that the numbers are kind of meaningless, but that increased property value reflects the very real desire people have to live in your city. They get to live near their friends and families, they get to access better jobs, to have a shorter commute, to send their kids to better schools. But when we block housing in high demand areas, we choke off this growth. From 2010 to 2016, San Francisco permitted 1 new home for every 13 new jobs. In suburban San Mateo County, it was 1 housing unit for every 17 jobs. That's a huge mismatch, and it drives up costs and limits opportunities for everyone. To be clear, no one is being forced to live in a city. If dense urban living isn't your style, that's fine. But blocking housing in high demand areas hurts everyone from an economic perspective. One property's gain doesn't have to mean another's loss. We can all benefit from better zoning policies that allow our cities to grow and thrive.
Zoning laws, originally designed to police the use of land, were contrived to raise higher and higher the minimum size of lots, to prevent the building of the lower-cost homes that were most desperately needed.